A production fee for your Hometown Health Connection was made by Buffalo Healthy Living Magazine and its sponsors. The COVID-19 pandemic has forever changed the world. We have lived through lockdowns, mask mandates, and various vaccine protocols, but what's next for us in the United States and the people across the globe? On this edition of your Hometown Health Connection, meet two doctors who have been nominated to win the Nobel Peace Prize. They're changing the world. Find out why their efforts will affect all of us on this special edition of your Hometown Health Connection. I'm John DeSciullo, and welcome to the program. We are pleased and honored to introduce you to Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Maria Bottazzi, dedicated to making an affordable COVID vaccine for individuals living in poorer countries that can't afford one. Now, despite an unlimited number of COVID vaccines available to people who want them in wealthier countries like our own, 2.9 billion people have not received a single dose. They are people living in poor countries like Africa, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Botswana, Latin America, so many more, for whom the vaccine is unaffordable and inaccessible. Now, knowing that unvaccinated populations will continue to keep COVID circulating, resulting in serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths, Dr. Hotez and Dr. Bottazzi developed a highly effective and affordable vaccine for the world. Their successful efforts have resulted in their nomination for the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Peter Hotez is co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development and professor and dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi is co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, professor and associate dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Welcome from Houston, Texas. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Bottazzi. Tell us why it is so important to vaccinate people, even in remote areas of the world that we never see, and how does this impact us here in the United States and other parts of the world?
Well, thank you, John, for having us in the program. And well, it's morally necessary, ethically necessary, but more importantly, I think it's because everybody should have access to essential medicines and essential solutions that could certainly keep them from getting sick. And how we have been benefited in our countries from receiving these vaccines already, many have not. And that ultimately has come back to us with the fact that we now have all these variants that ultimately come and bite us back, right? So it is important that we not only protect ourselves, but we ensure that everyone around the world is also protected.
Dr. Hotez, can you tell us about the Corbavax COVID vaccine that you and Dr. Bottazzi developed?
Sure. It relies on a very specific type of technology known as microbial fermentation in yeast. And the reason that's of interest is that's a similar technology used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that all of us got as kids. More importantly, that technology to make hepatitis B vaccine is in place in India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Thailand, Vietnam, Argentina, Brazil. So if you want to really make a vaccine locally produced and at scale for the 9 billion doses that you need to vaccinate the world's low and middle income countries, we think this is the technology to use because it's already in place. So it's a matter of plug and play. So all of our global health vaccines use similar types of technology, microbial fermentation, mostly in yeast. We do this for our parasitic disease vaccines for poor countries like schistosomiasis and hookworm infection. And we've done the same with SARS and MERS, the first two major coronavirus pandemics. And then when the COVID-19 sequence hit, we just flipped the technology towards COVID-19. And it was quite successful. Our team of 20 plus scientists worked day and night during the early time of the pandemic. And then we've transferred the technology to 4 vaccine producers with no patent to India, which is where the company is known as Biological E, Indonesia, where they're known as Biopharma, Bangladesh, where they're known as Incepta, and Botswana, where Immunity Bio is hoping to scale it up. India is the furthest along. And on our first week that it's gone into kids was last week. It's gone into 1.8 million kids in India last week, kids 12 and up. So that's really exciting. And now we're getting up to 10 million kids that have been immunized. So with this vaccine. So, we're really hoping that we can help close that equity gap for low and middle income countries.
That must give you, Dr. Hotez, great sense of accomplishment that you've been able to have so many children get that vaccine.
Well, this is, why we've been working together for the last 20 years and why I got my MD and PhD to do just that, make vaccines for the world. So it's an extraordinary feeling. And beyond the humanitarian driver is the fact that we know that these new variants of concerns like Delta and Omicron, now BA2, have been coming out of unvaccinated populations in low and middle income countries. So we think our vaccine could become an essential tool to finally shut down this pandemic.
Getting back to the technology a little bit, how different is what you're doing with all of that technology than how the other COVID vaccines that we hear so much about, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, is there a wide difference, or you're following the same path? For someone like me to understand that, how does that fly? How does that work?
So I can answer that if you want. So ultimately, the goal is the same. And for the most part, the target is the same. It's either the spike protein or a piece of the spike protein. In our case, is the receptor binding domain of the spike protein. But the distinction is really the technology that you use to produce the vaccine. The RNA technology, of course, requires that once it's immunized into a person, our own machinery has to read that RNA molecule and convert it into a protein and eventually present it to our body. The viral vectors, of course, have a DNA code that then becomes an RNA and then a protein. We use, again, a conventional technology, which is immunizing directly with a synthetic recombinantly made protein, vegan made, because using yeast doesn't have any animal derived nor any residuals from human cells, for example. And it's presented to the immune system. And that's a system that, as Peter mentioned, has been used before. The hepatitis B vaccine is a protein-based vaccine, the human papillomavirus, the pertussis vaccine. So our body already, certainly we know how it's processed, and we know now that it's certainly safe for many years of using it, even in very young kids. And we now see that it is as effective as, for example, even the RNA technology is.
Well, and in the research that Annette Pinter did from Buffalo Healthy Living magazine mentioned that there's a proven 5-decade history really of safety with this Corbavax vaccine. What makes it so safe, and where was it used before, and for what reason, with what age groups?
Well, this is the same technology used for the hepatitis B vaccine that's given to infants right now here in the United States. And that's one of its attractive features. In addition to being able to scale it up in low and middle income countries, it probably has one of the best safety profiles of any vaccine, and certainly any COVID vaccine. And it's also a vegan technology. So it's no human cells, no animal cells, no human proteins, animal proteins. So we think it'll also help close the vaccine hesitancy gap, because some people are concerned about the newer technology vaccines. And in fact, in Indonesia, they're going to make it as a halal version for Muslim majority countries because it is vegan.
I was going to bring that up a little later, but I'm glad you brought it up now, because how important is it for those cultural pieces of this to work? Because you want people to get vaccinated, you want them to accept this as a way to prevent COVID or any other disease. How important was it to create something that was culturally significant like that, the halal and the vegan?
Well, remember, the anti-vaccine movement, although it really first accelerated in Texas, is now a global movement, tragically, and it's undermining our ability to vaccinate people all over the world. I mean, here in the United States, for instance, since last May of 2021, 200,000 unvaccinated people lost their lives to COVID despite the widespread availability of vaccines. So anti-science aggression is now a leading killer of young and middle-aged adults in the United States and now globally as well. So if we can have a vaccine that can help overcome that, that's just one extra piece to this.
Doctors, I'll ask you both, and you can respond. Did you have to do clinical trials to determine how this is going to be effective? Did you test the vaccine? What did you learn from that? And did you do any of that? I'm sure you did.
So I can start first, and yes, of course, having created this technology in our laboratories and transitioned it over and transferred it over to these manufacturers. Each manufacturer has to work within their own country, within their own regulatory policies and procedures to evaluate not only how they make the vaccine and ensure the quality of the product, but then evaluate the safety and the efficacy. So it went through the same process that you would go if you would have produced it with a manufacturer in the US. Each manufacturer eventually owns, this technology and decides that pathway alongside their country and their regulatory bodies to ensure, like you said, I think it's very important for us that it keeps this cultural adaptability, right? That it's really something that it's evaluated in the context of who is going to use it, how it's going to use it, and who's actually providing those checks and balances to ensure that it's appropriate for their population to receive.
Dr. Hotez, you mentioned something very interesting. You mentioned this is patent-free, and talk to us about that. What does that mean, and how does that reduce the cost? And is this a very cost-effective way to create a vaccine to release to the world?
Well, we've seen how with onerous patent protections, this has become a barrier to access. And so you're seeing this happen now with Moderna and Pfizer and BioNTech vaccines, that patents are holding up the technology transfer. So we just wanted to make it easy and take it off the table. So not only do we not patent it, but we actually have published in the scientific literature, open access scientific literature, that anybody with a computer and internet connection can download all the through scientific publications, every step in the manufacturing process, how we've done this, how we discovered it, how we developed it. So actually anybody could reproduce it on their own if they wanted to. And what's more, and that same is true of the clinical trials, the phase 1, phase 2, and 3 clinical trials are all up in preprint form as well. We want to make this as accessible, just kind of break the ice on what's been happening around secrecy, lack of transparency, just cut through all of that and say this is a vaccine for the world.
So there really isn't anyone or is there anyone that's profiting from this? It seems unbelievable to think that.
Well, I think who's really profiting is the people who really need to receive this, that it's a benefit to them, right? And adding to the fact that they may be more amenable of receiving a vaccine made by, again, a technology that they have used before or their little kids have used before, those are the populations that will ultimately benefit. And if you think of it, by keeping these populations healthy, it ultimately has a clear impact on the security and the economic prosperity of those countries and those regions. So I think that ultimately there's many who will benefit, maybe with different levels of categorization of what is the profit. We believe that this is, clearly a profit for the people who really need it.
Right, the benefit is obviously a global benefit, and in many respects, you both are pioneers in trying to save the world. How did you both connect to come up with this concept, to develop this Corbavax vaccine, and come up with the humanitarian uniqueness to say, we're just going to get it out there for the world to benefit from?
Well, this has been our philosophy for all of our vaccines. So we've worked together now for 20 years, initially in Washington, D.C., and now we moved it to the Texas Medical Center, Texas Children's Hospital, and Baylor College of Medicine 11 years ago. And the idea was to use a technology that's widely accessible in terms of being used locally in many low and middle income countries to make the vaccines that the pharma companies are not in a position to make. So we started out with parasitic disease vaccines. That's been my lifelong interest, vaccines for diseases like female genital schistosomiasis and hookworm infection and Chagas disease. But then about 10 years ago, it was clear that coronavirus vaccines were orphaned as well. Nobody cared about coronavirus vaccines, but we recognized that now that you had SARS and then MERS, it was just a matter of time before you had the third major coronavirus. And sure enough, right on cue, it appeared. And the irony is all we know how to do is make low-cost vaccines, because for parasitic diseases of the poor, our health economists said, hey, if you charge more than a few dollars a dose, it'll never be used. So we designed all of our processes with that in mind. And, all of our lab meetings are about how to maximize production, reduce costs, make the least expensive vaccine possible. And also we do not pass on our research and development costs to the person getting the vaccine, this concept of delinking it, the costs of the R&D. And you do all those things and you can make a low-cost vaccine. So this vaccine in India is now being made for, I believe, 145 rupees a dose, which I had to look up. It's $1.90 a dose. Wow. So I think it's the cheapest of all of the COVID, the least expensive and easy to scale up, and simple refrigeration, best safety profile. So when you go down the checklist, it really does check all the boxes you'd want for a global health vaccine.
And if you add on top of that, the fact that we also can teach you how to do it, and that's why we love being embedded within an academic framework, right? Where else do you really go and learn how to make the vaccines, right? And I think that's another unique aspect, is that not only we put everything out in the public domain, but if someone wants to come, we have scientists coming from all over the world to learn how to do it alongside with us, or nowadays even through Zoom, right? We have virtual laboratory settings where we do everything through Zoom. So I think that that's another dimension. And besides checking all the boxes, we also are enabling this concept of decolonizing the way that we do vaccine science by teaching others of how to pretty much make their own vaccines by themselves.
Dr. Bottazzi, where did these vaccines get made? Do you make them in Texas, or do you make them in the country of origin if they have the opportunity to do that? And is there regulatory approval necessary in these countries that it goes to, or is it just something the FDA has to approve?
So we, of course, in our labs do make prototypes. They are I guess the starter kit of, how you make them, and then when we transfer those technologies, indeed, they are made locally through, again, like as I mentioned, through the agencies and all the standards that each of those countries require, which is pretty much nowadays very aligned. All the regulatory procedures are equal. It doesn't matter whether something is produced in the US or it's produced in India or in Latin America, the standard is exactly the same. They all have to, communicate with each other, and they all have to be harmonized. And that's why now you can, for example, many vaccines that our kids receive in Latin America, many are produced in India, many are produced in many other regions of the world. And the regulatories are the ones who standardize, of course, the quality and the information.
Well, we're going to take a short break here on your Hometown Health Connection. We'll be back to talk more about this amazing vaccine and what these two doctors are doing to save the world. We'll be right back. If you want to support Dr. Hotez, support Dr. Bottazzi and their teams, log on to this website to find out more and how you can donate. Here it is. It's www.texaschildrens.org/vaccinating-the-world. Welcome back to your Hometown Health Connection. I'm John DeSciullo, continuing our conversation with Doctors Peter Hotez and Maria Elena Bottazzi. Doctors, talk to us, Dr. Bottazzi, we'll start with you. Talk to us about the unique partnership that you've created with these developing country vaccine manufacturing networks. Is there a network that you work with the other major medicals, or is this an independent structure that you have put together?
Well, the network was put together by themselves, right? So all the developing country vaccine manufacturers, albeit they may not be considered multinationals, they collaborate and they work with each other indeed to create and strengthen their knowledge and share their own capacity and capability. So they've been in operation for many years. I think that that's something that a lot of people don't recognize, right? That they are a big group. They are in many countries, but they're not enough, right? They are, most of them also consolidated in very few regions around the world. Like, for example, in Latin America, it's only really 3 that are part of that network, Brazil and Argentina. There's potentially more capacity that could be built and to reinforce the vaccine manufacturing network. So we prefer to work with them because most of the times they have like-minded objectives, which is clearly some of them to make a profit because it is a business, sure. But most of them do work with their governments because most of the times vaccines are public goods. So the buyer and the recipient of these products are governments who then make them available for their populations. So there is already this infrastructure. So when we had to select who would be most aligned to this concept of global health and global access, we have been working with them for years to convince them at some level that they should take on some of the discoveries that we do in our laboratories for like vaccines like Peter mentioned, Chagas disease, Hookham disease, schistosomiasis, and see what kind of incentives we could give them to help us co-develop them. Now, of course, we have set the record that it can be done. And through the COVID-19, we have shown that this is a model that possibly could be replicated now for other diseases too.
Dr. Hotez, you say, and mentioned earlier in our conversation, you call it anti-science and misinformation, and you've struck a figure of 200,000 COVID deaths in the US alone that may have been the result of some of that misinformation that maybe some others have unfortunately had to listen to. And you've said that you anticipate the number will rise to 250,000 by May of this year, 2022. How do you attribute to the deaths with the unvaccinated? And how do you respond to that in the sense that people who are unvaccinated continue to live in that world, whether they believe in it or whether because they may have a health condition that maybe gives them the reason not to get the vaccine? It's a complicated question, I know.
They're victims of a fairly vast disinformation campaign, and it's even coming from some members of the House of Representatives and the Senate who openly espouse anti-vaccine sentiments. You're seeing it on some of the cable news networks at night, spreading false information and bringing on pseudo-intellectuals or contrarian intellectuals to make up stories about vaccines. And so this has become a very lethal undertaking. So actually I like to write books, and my newest book that I'm working on with Johns Hopkins University Press has the straightforward working title of Anti-Science Kills that goes into this. And if you think about it, 200,000 unvaccinated people needlessly threw their lives away because they refused to get vaccinated. I don't even know what you call it anymore. And other than the fact that when you think about the big social forces that we put in a lot of infrastructure to go up against, whether it's global terrorism or cyber attacks or nuclear proliferation, this is killing more than all of those other things combined. And so the U.S. Surgeon General has been looking into the social media companies and their role of Facebook, et cetera, and they do have a role in disseminating this, but it doesn't get to those who are pushing the content and generating the content. And I think we have to really look at that very seriously as a country.
I know you've both appeared on MSNBC, CNN, Fox. Your articles have been, and your interviews have been published in major journals across the country, but I wanted to just touch on one personal question before we run out of time. What was it like for you both when you heard that you were nominated for Nobel Peace Prize? I would imagine a very humbling experience that must have been.
Well, from my side, you're right. It's a bit of a validation of our philosophy of how access to health, appropriate technologies, indigenously produced, so that they could solve local problems, ultimately leads to a population that is healthy, that enables prosperity. And ultimately, when people live in prosperity, they can achieve peace. And so for me, it's just a privilege that our Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher thought of us beyond science, and in fact, diplomatically, nominating us for the Peace Prize, which is, amazing.
Dr. Hotez, how about for you?
Well, 40 years ago in the 1980s, I started my MD and PhD in New York at Cornell Medical School and Rockefeller Institute, now Rockefeller University. And the motto of the university at Rockefeller is Scientia pro bono humani generis, science for the good of humankind. And I believed that and started working on a hookworm vaccine 40 years ago. And so, 40 years of hard work to make vaccines for the world's poorest people. And so it's very meaningful and was very emotional also.
Well, you've had a very emotional life. I know you have a daughter with autism and a long history of opposing anti-vaccine groups. You've written several books, including Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. What's the most important thing you've learned about that experience?
Well, autism is a complicated situation, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is a very personal story about the fact that we did whole exome sequencing of Rachel and my wife and I to identify a new autism gene, and so Rachel's making her contribution as well. But I think the message is that as scientists, we have to be out there more in the public domain because we're too often silent. And that silence is being filled by anti-science, anti-vaccine groups. And unfortunately, they're winning in a Pyrrhic way. And so I think the other message is it's not for everybody, but I think we have to look at a new generation of scientists who are out there engaging the public and presenting a human face to science that right now is still missing.
Dr. Bottazzi, I know you need donations, and we're going to be offering, again, that information. How did the donations help you and Dr. Hotez?
Well, it certainly helps our scientists to have all the supplies, reagents necessary for us to apply the creativity that comes out of our scientific discussions to test them out and, of course, develop these prototypes and train the next generation. Everybody, of course, needs resources to support the faculty, support the staff, and certainly get access to necessary equipment and reagents. So anything, and we've been very privileged for many that have reached out to us, from big and small, to be able to help us out with our labs. So we appreciate very much the philanthropic nature of not only the Houston community, but clearly the entire world community. So thank you.
Well, we thank you for everything that you are doing. Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi, Dr. Peter Hotez, over there in Houston, Texas, we thank you for your humanitarian and selfless humanitarian efforts. Thank you very much for joining us on the Zoom.
Thank you. Thanks for giving attention to this.
We thank Dr. Bottazzi and Dr. Hotez for joining us from Houston, Texas. If you would like to help them and their teams, remember this website. You can donate to texaschildrens.org/vaccinating-the-world. We thank them for joining us and for sharing their humanitarian effort across the world. I'm John DeSciullo. Thanks for joining us on your Hometown Health Connection. Be safe and be well. A production fee for the preceding presentation of Your Hometown Health Connection was made by Buffalo Healthy Living Magazine and its sponsors.